They're both vital public services, polar opposites in some ways, but between them their problems are filling the newspapers and the airwaves. Thames Water, the giant privatised utility that provides water for a quarter of the population, is not only under sustained fire for dumping sewage, but is reportedly on the brink of financial collapse. The National Health Service, 75 years old today, of course, is still largely nationalised, but is facing difficulties some regard as existential. Despite soaking up nearly half government day-to-day spending, the former health secretary said this week the UK was in danger of becoming a health service with a country attached. Its outcomes are poor when measured against those of other countries. The latest King's Fund survey shows that rated against a score of comparable countries on things like cancer survival rates, heart attacks, strokes, ambulance response times, the UK is the worst or second worst on many of them. The argument over who should own public services is not just political and utilitarian, which works best, but essentially a moral question about competing visions of a good society. One side sees competition and profit driving efficiency and choice. The other regards some services, railways, energy, education as well perhaps, as too vital and perhaps too essentially monopolistic to be left to business and the market. Can profit coexist with the common good? What obligations do private companies have to society? Can a market be moral? That's our Moral Maze tonight. The panel, Melanie Phillips, social commentator at The Times, Mona Siddiqui, Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at Edinburgh University, Carmody Gray, Assistant Professor of Catholic Theology at Durham University, and the Anglican priest and opinionator, Giles Fraser. Mona Siddiqui, are you conflicted on this or very firmly one way or the other?
You've used the very word I want to begin with. I am very conflicted about this topic. But I do think that the private-public distinction and binary is a little crude. I think for me the most interesting aspect of the debate is the issue of accountability. When things go wrong, whether things are publicly or privately run, who is ultimately responsible, and whether it erodes the nature of democratic citizenship itself.
Giles, I really get the impression you're not at all conflicted about this.
Thames Water's a morality tale of the foolishness of privatising utility that is a necessary public good. Since it was sold off debt-free to private equity investment vehicles, our water's racked up vast debts to pay shareholders. It's close to going under, and left us and our waterways literally in the brown stuff. If something is too important to fail, it should not be in private hands.
Melanie Phillips?
I am torn. I believe that private business generates wealth, choice and freedom, and nationalised utilities were pretty rubbish when we had them. On the other hand, I do very strongly believe in communal responsibility, and some privatised utilities, as we can see, are pretty rubbish too. So I'm looking for tonight's discussion to find some coherent moral principles.
Carmody Gray.
I'm not against privatisation in principle, and I'm not against state ownership in principle. It does seem to me, though, that there's a couple of moral blindnesses in our current debate. Two things in particular. Firstly, the innocent assumption that the market always delivers the best outcomes for everyone, and that it only needs to be set free in order to magically produce universal goods. That seems to me patently untrue. And secondly, the general refusal to consider the possibility that there are some goods and activities the monetisation of which contradicts their character.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Kat Hobbs, who's founder and director of We Own It, a group that campaigns against the privatisation of public services. Thames Water's problem must be giving you plenty of ammunition, I imagine. You're too young to remember the mess the water industry was in before privatisation, chronically underfunded, repeatedly prosecuted because it couldn't meet European standards for clean water.
Thank you for having me on the programme. Well, I think it's not just Thames Water. When we look at public services across the board, the UK's been through an extreme ideological experiment since the 80s. And so when we're talking about water, but also energy, rail, buses, Royal Mail, the NHS, it's all... We seem to have something against the idea of a mixed economy in this country. So, I sympathise with some of what the panel said. Privatisation, I think most people feel, has been an absolute unmitigated disaster. And when you look at the polling, what you see is that 60 to 70% of people across the board, for all those services I mentioned, want to see public services in public hands. And a majority
sorry to interrupt, it's a bit more complicated than that, isn't it? An awful lot of people want the airlines to stay privatised, for instance. But anyway, I won't go into that. Melanie Phillips.
I'm interested in your organisation. It's called We Own It. May I ask you, who is we? By which I mean, is we the state or the people? And do you think that there is a significant difference between the two when it comes to privatisation, nationalisation?
Great question. So we are a voice for public service users because we want to represent that majority of, including conservative voters who believe in public ownership. And we think we need public services in public hands because that is the norm in lots of European countries and it works better. You know, if you look at, for example, public transport in Switzerland, the way that Denmark and Norway run energy and innovators in renewable energy, if you look at these examples, and if you also look at examples closer to home, so there's lots of publicly run institutions that work incredibly well, but we do want to see accountability mechanisms built in, because I think it's really clear from Thames Water and all of these examples that public services are often natural monopolies. Essentially, there's not really competition. So we don't have consumer mechanisms to hold these organisations to account. That means we need other kinds of accountability mechanisms. So we need to have public service users being part of this conversation and part of governance. For example, if you look at the way that Paris runs its water, consumers are involved in governance, workers are involved in governance, they have water scientists on their board, and they have much better outcomes as well. So I think we're talking about public ownership that represents the broad public to get the kinds of outcomes that we need in society when we're facing challenges such as rivers and seas filled with sewage, climate crisis, water sewage shortages.
You're talking about public services. Are you, just to be clear, are you saying that, in your view, all public services should be nationalised, or are you simply talking about what we might call the essential utilities, like water? We can have a discussion about what is actually essential, but say take water. Are you talking more generally or about essential public services?
So the way that we think about public services is they tend to be essential infrastructure. They tend to be things that we need for a good life. They are often natural monopolies, or there's not meaningful competition. And that's not just in water. You can see that in other services too. And they're often things where we need some element of democracy. So they're things that affect the common good. They should be there for the public good. Mm-hmm. And so we can't just rely on markets to do all of that work for us. We have to have a better solution.
OK, but you say elements of democracy and you talk about accountability mechanisms need to be built in, and I entirely agree with you. But, when we have state-run institutions, we don't have accountability. We have institutions like, for example, the health service, which looks upwards through serried ranks of managers to its political masters rather than downwards to the people. The people there is no accountability to the people. There's no control or leverage by the people. Doesn't that matter when you talk about accountability? Isn't that absolutely essential?
I think it does matter. And you do have patient groups, and you do have, I believe, in the health service, an incredible set of people who are dedicated to the health of the nation. And I think it's absolutely outrageous the way that this government has underfunded our health service, 18% less than other EU 14 countries, so that we've got a £40 billion hole in the budget each year, and privatised it, handing it over to private companies for test and trace, wasting £33 billion. Yes, we need accountability built in, but the big picture here is that this government is undermining the fabric of our society by cutting and privatising these public services that are essential to our life, and they're the most civilised thing that we have.
Mona?
Just on that point, some would argue that government has actually pumped a lot of money into the National Health Service, and all the ills of the National Health Service aren't simply about privatisation or nationalisation. It's about how these institutions are actually run. And the National Health Service is a state-funded operation.
Yeah, we can always look at running things better. I think we should have public service users more involved. But the key health think tanks have just come out in absolute unanimity saying the health service has been let down by this government, let down by the lack of funding, and that's a very clear...
But would you say then that the state always acts in the public interest?
No, I think obviously not. We need to hold the state accountable. But
who's the we? This is what I'm trying to wrestle with. So you've laid out a picture of democratic governance, but in the end, democratic governance will also be a selection of people working with the state, and they may get it wrong.
Yeah, and nothing's perfect in human institutions. But, right now we have key essential infrastructure working for a handful of shareholders around the world rather than for the British public. And what we could be doing is saying, instead of spending this money that we're wasting on Ofwat and inadequate structures that have failed us for 34 years in the case of Ofwat, why not have public service users going to the meetings of Thames Water, being able to stop on the high street at a shop where you can find out about how it's doing, being able to access all of the data, being able to use accountability mechanisms.
Is there any evidence that nationalising institutions will improve the situation?
Yes, absolutely. So we need to look at Scottish Water. So Scottish Water was never privatised like the water in England. They invest 35% more in their infrastructure. If England had invested at that rate, an extra £28 billion would have gone into the infrastructure to deal with things like sewage and leaks instead of...
Isn't one of the issues there, though, that when things are running well, most of us aren't concerned about who's running the organisation? It's only when things go wrong that we start to talk about nationalisation.
I think that's a good question. I think lots of people there's a spectrum of how involved people want to be. But I would say when you look at some of the campaigns happening on water right now, Surfers Against Sewage, SOS Whitstable, all of these great campaigns that are happening, and we're campaigning it, we own it too. There's lots of people in this country who look at the situation where we have dead fish in our rivers and seas, where we have people getting ill when they swim, and they want to be involved.
But let me ask you a broader question. So if I invest in the healthcare, and I also make money out of it, but at the same time my investment is helping millions of people, what's wrong with that?
Well, I don't think private sector investment is helping. And what we've seen across the board is that
where's the evidence that that's not helping?
Well, where is the evidence that it is? If you look at what happened to our services, we were promised lower costs and better services 40 years ago. What we've seen is higher costs, worse services across the board when you look at our public services, and we have nothing that we can do about it. It's just not good enough.
Kat Hobbs, thanks very much indeed.